In the vast, infinite expanse of space, where the distant stars shimmer like faint whispers of ancient secrets, lies a remarkable structure, an outpost of humanity on the surface of the moon. The Lunar Diplomatic Station stands as a gleaming testament to human ambition. With its silver columns reflecting the weak light of distant galaxies, the massive rotating rings of the station cast ever-changing shadows across the moon's barren, cratered surface. This station serves as the primary meeting point for civilizations from all over the galaxy, striving to form alliances, share knowledge, and, above all, maintain a fragile peace in the vastness of the cosmos. Amidst this technologically advanced environment, one man walks with purpose through the gleaming halls. He is Captain Ethan Cross, a soldier who has volunteered for a mission that others fear, a mission to partake in the Vora Connection Ritual, a perilous diplomatic procedure that has claimed the lives of 3 previous candidates. Ethan is not just another soldier. He is one of the few who possesses the necessary courage and skills for this task. A soldier who has faced the unknown before. But this time, the stakes are far greater than anything he's encountered. The Vora are a race of towering giants, their immense size and telepathic abilities making them an enigma. Their species has not shown much interest in meaningful contact with humans. The ritual is said to be a means of bridging the psychological and emotional gap between humans and Vora, allowing for a true connection between the two species. However, 3 previous candidates for this ritual have died, and the process itself is shrouded in mystery and danger. Captain Cross knows that this is his moment. He is expendable, with no family or personal attachments. And yet, his decision to volunteer is driven by something more profound, a recognition that humanity cannot afford to be alone in a universe full of powerful and unpredictable forces. Captain Cross, General Daniel Hayes said, his voice low and filled with concern. Are you really volunteering for the Vora Connection Ritual? The same ritual that has already claimed the lives of 3 candidates? The general's face was etched with the weight of experience and doubt. Ethan, standing firm in his military uniform, met the general's gaze unwaveringly. Yes, sir, I'm volunteering because no one else will. The Vora are too important for us to ignore. We need allies, not distant neighbors. The general's expression tightened, and he gestured toward a holographic display of the Vora warrior. You realize the danger. These beings are twice your size and possess telepathic abilities we barely understand. They've shown no interest in meaningful contact with us. Ethan's eyes lingered on the hologram of the Vora warrior, a towering figure with imposing features. That's exactly why we need to try harder. Sir, the galaxy is changing. We need to step up. Despite his usual calm demeanor, the tension in the room was palpable. The general paused, clearly hesitant, before giving a nod. Very well, Cross. But remember, this isn't about your bravery alone. We need results, not sacrifices. So why did Captain Cross volunteer for such a dangerous and uncertain mission? It wasn't for glory or fame. It wasn't even out of a sense of personal ambition. For Ethan, it was about something much larger, something that transcended his personal interests. Humanity had no choice but to connect with the Vora, with no family to return to and no personal ties to keep him grounded. He was a perfect candidate for the task. He knew what was at stake: alliances, survival, and the future of humanity itself. His lack of attachments made him ideal for this mission. He was willing to face the unknown, knowing that the connections made here could alter the course of human history. As Captain Cross stood in the Grand Hall, the diplomats of various species milling about in their colorful attire, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. He was a soldier, trained for combat, not for delicate diplomacy. But today, he wasn't just another soldier. Today, he was humanity's last hope for making peace with one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. The fate of human-Vora relations lay in his hands. The eyes of the assembled diplomats turned toward him. There was something about this mission that felt different. There was no turning back now. As the doors to the hall slid open, revealing the Vora representative, Ariela, Captain Cross felt a pang of uncertainty. Ariela was a massive figure, towering over everyone else, her blue skin shimmering under the artificial light of the station. She wore ceremonial armor that further amplified her imposing presence. As she stepped forward, the room fell silent. It was clear. The stakes had just risen to a whole new level. The Lunar Diplomatic Station, with its metallic gleam and hum of advanced technology, seemed almost too quiet as the massive doors to the Grand Assembly Hall slowly slid open. Ethan Cross stood at attention, his military discipline firmly in place, but a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. He had been prepared for many things: the dangers of the Vora Connection Ritual, the unpredictability of interspecies diplomacy, but he had not prepared himself for this. Through the archway, stepping into the room with a presence so powerful it seemed to shift the air itself, came Ariela, the Vora representative. She was a giant, towering over everyone in the room, even the tallest of the diplomats. At 8 feet tall, her presence alone commanded respect. Her skin was a deep, ethereal blue, catching the artificial light as she moved with a grace that defied her size. Her armor, elaborately designed with intricate symbols of her warrior caste, shimmered with every step she took, reflecting the light in ways that made her seem almost otherworldly. The room fell silent. No one had ever seen a Vora representative in person before, and Ariela's towering form made the diplomats and ambassadors from various species appear as children by comparison. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to maintain his composure. This was it, the first real step in bridging a gap that had existed for centuries. Ariela ducked slightly to clear the entranceway, her gaze sweeping across the room with quiet intensity. It was not a hostile gaze, but a cold, analytical one, like that of a scientist observing a new specimen. She stopped, and for a moment, her deep purple eyes locked onto Ethan's. It was a gaze that seemed to pierce through him, and for the briefest of seconds, Ethan wondered if she was judging him, if she had already decided whether he was worthy of the ritual. Ethan couldn't help but feel a wave of discomfort. He had studied her people for months, prepared for this moment, but standing in front of Ariela made the weight of his task seem even more monumental. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm, betraying no sign of his nervousness. "Welcome to the Lunar Diplomatic Station, Ariela," he said, his words carefully measured in the Vora language, Valoran, which he had been perfecting for the past few months. His pronunciation was not flawless, but it was adequate. Ariela's expression shifted slightly. Was that a hint of surprise? Her purple eyes narrowed, a glimmer of something, amusement, perhaps, flickering in her gaze. "You are smaller than expected," she commented, her voice rich with an alien cadence that the translation devices couldn't quite capture. The room erupted in a low ripple of nervous laughter. Ethan stood his ground, not flinching. "Good things come in small packages, as we say on Earth," he replied, forcing a slight smile. His attempt at humor, however feeble, was a defense mechanism, one he had perfected through years of dealing with different alien species. "Humor," she noted, her voice neutral, "a curious defense mechanism." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Not a defense, just a way to communicate. Sometimes, the best way to break down barriers is to laugh at them." Ariela tilted her head, clearly intrigued by the human's confidence. "You speak our language well, for a human." "I've had 3 months to prepare," Ethan replied, "though I'm sure my accent is terrible." "It is adequate," she responded, almost dismissively, but Ethan could sense the faintest hint of amusement in her tone. Something was shifting, whether it was respect or mere curiosity. He couldn't tell, but he wasn't going to stop now. As the formal introductions continued, Ethan noticed Ariela watching him from across the room. Her gaze wasn't hostile, but it was analytical. Every gesture, every word he spoke seemed to be weighed, measured, studied. It was as if she was trying to figure him out. And as the evening unfolded, he began to feel something strange, something subtle in the air between them. A connection, perhaps. It wasn't much, but the brief moments when their eyes met seemed to carry weight. As though, despite their differences, they were starting to understand each other in ways words couldn't fully express. Later, during the formal dinner, Ethan found himself seated directly across from Ariela. The table had been specially designed to accommodate the various anatomies and dietary needs of the species present. But for the first time, he was more concerned with the being sitting before him than the meal on his plate. Ariela, delicate in her own alien way, manipulated a set of tiny utensils, each designed for a species far larger than her human counterpart. As she picked at her food, her purple eyes never left him. "Tell me, Captain Cross," she asked, her voice soft but sharp with curiosity. Why did you volunteer for this mission? Ethan paused for a moment. The question was simple, yet the weight of it hung in the air. Honest answer or diplomatic one? He asked, giving her a knowing look. Ariela's expression didn't change, but there was something in her gaze that urged him to be truthful. Honest. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. I volunteered because everyone else was too afraid to try. His words were blunt, but they carried the honesty of someone who had no reason to hide. I'm afraid too. Terrified, in fact, he admitted, taking a small sip of his wine to steady himself. But fear is only useful if it sharpens your focus, not dulls it. For the first time that evening, Ariela set down her utensils, her full attention now on him. Her eyes glimmered with an unspoken understanding. You are unexpected, Captain Cross. Ethan gave her a wry smile. Call me Ethan. If we're going to try to make this work, I think we should be on a first-name basis. Ariela paused for a moment, her expression unreadable. The connection is not assured, she reminded him. Ethan's smile widened. We'll get there, he said with quiet confidence. Despite the tension in the room, the exchange between them had subtly shifted. Ariela's steely demeanor had cracked, if only for a moment, and in its place was something new, something akin to curiosity. Perhaps she hadn't expected a human soldier to be so direct. Perhaps, beneath the surface, she was beginning to see him not just as a candidate for the connection ritual, but as a person. As the evening wore on and the formalities continued, Ethan couldn't help but glance at her from time to time. There was an unexpected feeling stirring within him, a pull toward this enigmatic alien warrior. He was there to perform a task, yes, but as the night went on, something else began to take root, something more personal, something that neither of them could have anticipated. The evening that had started so ceremoniously took a sharp turn as a loud, sudden alarm echoed through the Lunar Diplomatic Station. The once serene atmosphere of the Grand Hall shattered in an instant, replaced by flashing red lights and the blaring sound of emergency warnings. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine as his military training kicked in, his instincts sharper than ever. The room immediately fell into chaos as diplomats, ambassadors, and security personnel scrambled for cover. Security breach in Sector 7. The automated voice announced, its tone cold and urgent. Unknown hostiles have breached the hull. All diplomatic personnel proceed to secure areas immediately. Ethan's heart raced. Sector 7 was near the station's core, critical to maintaining the station's energy and life support systems. If the terrorists could compromise it, the entire station would be in jeopardy. He needed to act fast. Ariela, who had been standing a few steps away, turned towards him, her massive frame tensing as she recognized the threat. Without hesitation, she moved toward Ethan, her presence like an unstoppable force. Her gaze locked with his, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. They were both soldiers in this battle now. We need to move, now, Ethan said, already pulling out his sidearm from its holster, eyes scanning the room for the quickest exit route. His military mind was working on overdrive, calculating the best way to approach the situation. Ariela's eyes narrowed in determination, her voice low but firm. I know this station's layout. Follow me. Ethan didn't hesitate. Despite the size difference, Ariela moved with terrifying speed, her tall form navigating the hallways effortlessly. They ducked down a corridor, their footsteps echoing through the otherwise quiet space. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to piece together a plan while also staying ahead of the growing chaos. He needed to get to Sector 7 before it was too late. You memorized the layout? Ethan asked, impressed. Ariela didn't answer immediately. Instead, she led the way, her steps sure and purposeful, clearly familiar with every corner of the station. She had been preparing for this moment, just as he had, and now they were working in tandem. Part of the preparations, she said simply, her voice a deep rumble that resonated in the quiet corridor. I am no stranger to battle. Small warrior, we move quickly, or there will be no station left to defend. The urgency in her voice matched the tension in Ethan's chest as they neared the maintenance tunnels, a shortcut that would get them to Sector 7 faster than any other route. As they approached the entrance, Ariela paused for a brief moment, eyeing the narrow tunnel warily. I will fit, she growled, a note of amusement in her voice, though it was clear she didn't enjoy the idea of crawling through cramped spaces. Ethan shot her a grin. "You'll be fine. I'm more worried about keeping up with you." With that, they both squeezed into the tight maintenance tunnel, maneuvering through the narrow space, with Ariela's massive form making it a bit more challenging for her to navigate. But her agility was undeniable, and she adapted quickly. "Stay close," Ethan warned, leading the way, his military instincts on high alert. "We don't know how many hostiles are ahead." As they emerged from the tunnel, the hum of the station's systems became louder, and the faint smell of burning metal mixed with the acrid scent of plasma-filled air. They had arrived at the entrance to Sector 7, but they weren't alone. Ahead of them, 3 figures in environmental suits stood near a breach in the outer wall, cutting through with plasma cutters to access the station's core. The sight of them immediately sent a chill down Ethan's spine. These weren't just your average terrorists, these were professional mercenaries, well-equipped and highly dangerous. Ethan quickly assessed the situation, silently counting the number of enemies. 3 attackers, all busy with their tools, unaware of the threat coming from behind. Ariela silently stepped into position, ready for action, her eyes sharp as she gauged their movements. Ethan crouched down, signaling for Ariela to wait. He would take the first shot to get the element of surprise. His training had prepared him for moments like this. Stealth was key. Without warning, Ariela surged forward like a wild force of nature. Her massive form, once poised and calm, now moved with the ferocity of a seasoned warrior. She closed the distance between them faster than the attackers could react, her strength sending one of the mercenaries crashing into the wall with a force so powerful that it cracked his helmet's faceplate. Ethan swore under his breath. Scrambling to keep up, he opened fire, aiming for the weapons of the remaining attackers, his precision honed through years of military training. The first mercenary's plasma cutter fell to the ground as the weapon's power supply was disabled. The second attacker was already backing away, retreating into the corner, but Ethan was too fast. His next shot disarmed him in one clean move. The third attacker tried to rush them, but Ethan was ready. With a swift motion, he ducked, rolled, and tackled the mercenary to the ground, knocking his weapon from his hands in a quick, fluid maneuver. It wasn't over yet, though, as Ethan turned to check for more threats. Ariela's voice reached him through their growing telepathic bond, the intensity of her mental pulse vibrating through his mind. "Behind you," she warned, her voice sharp with urgency. Ethan spun around just in time to see the fourth attacker, a masked figure, preparing to fire. Ariela moved faster than any human could track, lifting a piece of debris and launching it at the assailant with such force that the attacker was knocked out cold before he could fire a shot. The fight was over in a matter of minutes. The station's emergency systems had kicked in, and the lights flickered back to normal. The terrorists lay incapacitated around them, and security personnel were on their way to secure the area. Ethan and Ariela stood, breathing heavily, their bodies covered in sweat and blood from the brief but intense combat. As they surveyed the area, the sounds of distant alarms faded, and the adrenaline began to subside. Ariela stepped closer to Ethan, her towering presence looming over him. "Your combat skills are acceptable," she said with a grunt of respect. "Not bad for a small warrior." Ethan wiped the blood from his split lip, flashing a grin despite the pain. "Not so bad yourself, but maybe next time, we can work on the subtlety." Ariela's laugh, half growl, half chuckle, rumbled through her chest. "Subtlety is overrated," she said with a dismissive wave, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and admiration. "You knew I would choose direct action," she added, her tone more thoughtful now. "Yet, you adapted your strategy around it. Why?" Ethan met her gaze with a steady expression. "Because that's what connection is about. It's not about trying to change each other. It's about working together despite our differences." Ariela studied him for a long moment before she reached down and gently touched the cut on his lip. Her massive fingers, usually so capable of destruction, were surprisingly gentle. "Perhaps," she said softly, "you are not entirely inadequate after all, Captain Cross." Ethan couldn't help but grin. There was something undeniably powerful in her words. In that instant, the bond between them shifted from mere military alliance to something more. Something personal. As the station's security teams arrived to take over the situation, Ethan and Ariela exchanged a silent understanding. They had just fought side by side, and in doing so, had forged a connection that neither of them had expected. The terrorists were subdued, but something much greater had been achieved in that moment. A bridge had begun to form between two warriors. Two souls, who had no choice but to face the chaos together. The battle had been fierce, but the true test was just beginning. The chaos of the recent attack had barely settled. The station had returned to a tense sort of normalcy, with heightened security and diplomats still processing the events of the day. Yet, amidst all the alarms, the danger, and the adrenaline, something even more formidable awaited Ethan and Ariela. The true challenge of the Vora Connection Ritual loomed ahead, and both knew that their training would be just as dangerous, if not more so, than any external threat. The next morning, after a restless night, Ethan arrived at the training facility located in the heart of the Lunar Diplomatic Station. The room was stark, designed to accommodate the unique needs of multiple species. A soft hum filled the air, the artificial gravity adjusting automatically for different races. The walls were lined with holographic displays, and in the center of the room stood a large, circular mat designed for combat and physical training. As Ethan stepped inside, he wasn't surprised to find Ariela already there. The Vora warrior's imposing form moved fluidly through a series of combat stances. Her every movement an expression of power and precision. Her silver-blue skin glistened under the lights, and despite her enormous size, there was an elegance to her technique, an artistry that could only come from years of intense training. She was focused. As always, nothing less than perfection was acceptable to her. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She wasn't just a giant warrior, she was a living testament to the discipline of her people. A creature whose every muscle seemed honed for battle. Early, I see. Ariela's deep voice rumbled, never breaking her rhythm. Her eyes didn't leave her own reflection in the mirrored walls as she completed another sequence of moves. Couldn't sleep, Captain? Ethan shook his head, removing his jacket and rolling up his sleeves. Thought I might as well get started. Ariela completed her sequence, finally turning to face him. The connection ritual requires more than physical preparation. Small warrior, she said, her tone as commanding as ever. I know, Ethan replied, adjusting his stance, but we might as well start with the basics. The first phase of their training was physical conditioning, and it wasn't just about matching each other in combat. It was about understanding each other's body and strengths. For Ariela, this meant scaling down her usual style of fighting to accommodate her partner, while Ethan had to push himself to the limit just to keep up. Their training combined human military exercises with the Valoran warrior techniques, blending speed, power, and flexibility into a single, fluid routine. Ariela demonstrated a series of rapid, fluid strikes and blocks. Each move was a devastating show of force, and Ethan struggled to match her precision. Her strength was unparalleled, but it was her speed and agility that took him by surprise. With each clash of their limbs, human muscle against alien strength, Ethan's body ached. But his mind remained focused. He had been trained in the best military academies, but this was unlike any training he had ever experienced. With each new move, he felt his muscles scream for rest, but Ariela's relentless pacing left him no room for hesitation. You are quick, Ariela noted, her voice not quite a compliment but more of an observation. Her purple eyes flickered with something that might have been approval. But you lack power. You are light, agile, but you cannot win with speed alone. Ethan grinned through his exhaustion. I'll work on it. As the hours passed, their physical conditioning gave way to something far more challenging: mental synchronization. The connection ritual wasn't just about physical strength, it required complete alignment between their minds and emotions. It was a delicate dance of thoughts and feelings, where every move, every pulse of energy, had to be in perfect harmony. Ariela stood facing Ethan now, her imposing figure towering over him. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but he had learned long ago not to flinch under pressure. Her voice softened as she spoke. Relax, she instructed, her tone calm, though her deep voice still carried an edge of authority. Her massive hands hovered near his temples, a gesture so gentle that it was almost jarring against the sheer power she exuded. You hold your thoughts too tightly. Your mind is like a clenched fist. Open it, let it be free. Ethan's brow furrowed. This was new. No one had ever taught him how to open his mind. In his line of work, mental fortification was vital for survival. But now, Ariela's words felt like a challenge to everything he had been trained to do. His mind was his greatest weapon. But now he was being asked to trust her, perhaps more than he trusted anyone else. Easier said than done, Ethan muttered, trying to keep his breathing steady as he focused on her words. He had faced countless enemies, fought off waves of threats, but the idea of exposing his innermost thoughts was something entirely different. Ariela's voice was firm, her fingers barely touching his forehead now. Enemies do not warn before they strike. Neither will I. With those words, Ariela's mind brushed against his, sending an electric jolt of sensation through his body. It was like static electricity but more intense, something far more powerful. More immediate than anything he had ever felt before. His heart skipped a beat as his thoughts swirled, momentarily lost in the sensation of her presence. "You are strong," Ariela murmured, her voice now a whisper in his mind, as though speaking to the core of his being. "But you are rigid, you must become like water." Ethan gasped, pulling back slightly as the pressure of her presence faded. For a moment, his mind felt like it was on fire, caught between the feeling of her touch and his own consciousness. He staggered back, breathless. "You warned me this time," he managed to joke, his voice a little shakier than he would have liked. Ariela's deep chuckle rumbled in the air. "There is no warning when you are facing the truth." Ethan knew she was right. This wasn't just physical training. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about something far deeper, connecting on a level that transcended body and mind. As the day went on, Ethan's mental walls began to weaken. Little by little, the pressure of Ariela's telepathic touch began to feel less like an invasion and more like an invitation. He started to sense her thoughts, feel the subtle nuances of her emotions, her pride, her fierce determination, and perhaps, buried beneath it all, a flicker of something that resembled doubt. Ariela, in turn, started to sense the deeper layers of Ethan's own mind. She felt the loneliness he carried, the burden of leadership, and the way he held himself back, not just from her, but from the world. She could feel his longing to bridge the gap between their species, and the unspoken hope that this mission, this connection, was more than just a diplomatic necessity. It was personal. "You hide much beneath the surface," Ariela said, her voice quiet as they took a brief break. She studied him with the intensity of a warrior watching her prey. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes meeting hers. "It's easier to hide things sometimes. It will make the ritual harder," she warned, her gaze softening for just a fraction of a second. "You cannot hide from me forever, Captain Cross." For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to relax. Maybe he hadn't fully opened his mind yet, but something had shifted. He wasn't just facing a physical challenge now, he was facing the kind of connection that could change everything. "I'll try," he replied, his voice steady, and for the first time, Ariela gave him a nod of approval, an acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, they were on the right path. The session ended, and Ethan stood still, breathing heavily from the mental exertion. The tension between him and Ariela, once built on the necessity of the mission, was now shifting into something far more profound. The training had only just begun, but it was clear to both of them that the path ahead would be more difficult and more rewarding than either had anticipated. The true connection, the bond they both needed to form, was not just about overcoming physical obstacles. It was about understanding each other on a deeper, more intimate level, and Ethan Cross knew, as he wiped the sweat from his face and looked at Ariela, that the challenges ahead would test them both in ways they hadn't yet begun to imagine. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The Lunar Diplomatic Station, once a beacon of hope for interspecies diplomacy, had become a pressure cooker of political strife. The air was thick with tension as news spread that the Vora Connection Ritual was underway, and opposition was mounting from both human and Vora factions. There was a growing fear that the ritual, intended to bond their two species, could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. Captain Ethan Cross and Ariela, the towering Vora representative, had just completed a grueling training session. Their bond had been slowly growing, not just through physical and mental exertion, but through something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. They were starting to understand one another, not just as diplomats or soldiers, but as two beings, united by a purpose much greater than themselves. However, their newfound connection was about to be tested in ways they never anticipated. As the two of them walked through the corridors of the station, Ethan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. He had hoped that their progress would be met with support, but instead, it seemed the more they connected, the more those in power on both sides felt threatened. The fate of the ritual, and with it, the future of human-Vora relations, was hanging by a thread. That afternoon, Ambassador Chen, a senior figure in the Human Diplomatic Corps, approached Ethan. His usually composed demeanor was now fraught with concern. The man's expression was tight, his eyes darting around as if to ensure no one was listening. "Captain Cross," Chen began, lowering his voice to a whisper, "I need to speak with you in private." Ethan followed him into a nearby conference room. The door ceiling shut behind them. The sudden shift in atmosphere was jarring, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Chen's face was grim. "There's growing opposition to this project, from both the human and Vora sides." His eyes were filled with unease. Some believe the connection ritual will give the Vora too much influence over human affairs. Others fear that humans will dominate the Vora. Ethan leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "I knew there would be resistance, but this is getting out of hand." Chen nodded, his voice dropping lower. "There's already been talk of shutting the whole thing down. The Vora believe that the ritual will make them too dependent on humanity, while human conservatives think that an alliance with the Vora will weaken Earth's position in the galaxy. It's all political maneuvering. And now, with what happened at the power core, the situation has escalated." Ethan's heart sank. The attack had been a warning, a sign that not everyone was happy with the direction things were going. The rebels or mercenaries responsible for the sabotage were just the beginning. The true conflict, however, was about to unfold in the diplomatic halls of the station. "They're trying to stop us," Ethan said, his voice sharp with realization. "We have to finish what we started, or we'll lose everything." Chen sighed, clearly torn. "Just be careful, Captain. Keep your eyes open, and watch your back. There are factions on both sides that would rather see this ritual fail than see a new balance of power in the galaxy." Later that afternoon, the Grand Assembly Hall was filled with representatives from multiple species, all gathered to discuss the progress of human-Vora relations. The tension was palpable as the discussions grew more heated with every passing moment. Ethan stood with Ariela at the center of the room, his mind on the ominous words of Ambassador Chen. Every glance, every whisper from the gathered diplomats felt charged with suspicion. He knew they were watching him and Ariela closely, looking for signs of weakness, looking for any reason to halt the ritual before it could succeed. As the meeting unfolded, the true political divides became evident. On one side, a group of human diplomats, led by Admiral Harold Wright, voiced their concerns over the growing influence of the Vora. They feared that the connection ritual would lead to humanity becoming subjugated under the Vora's telepathic abilities. Admiral Wright slammed his fist down on the table. "This ritual is a dangerous gamble. The Vora are not our allies. They are an enemy we have yet to understand. We risk losing our sovereignty if we allow this ritual to continue. We must stop it now, before it's too late." Across the room, a Vora diplomat, Merrick, stood, his towering form casting a shadow over the human representatives. "We do not need your permission to form bonds," he said, his voice a deep growl. "This ritual is our right. You humans are weak to fear. You are afraid of what you do not understand." The argument escalated, voices rising in anger. The diplomats were at each other's throats, divided not only by species but by the deep-rooted fear of what the connection between humans and Vora could mean. To the Vora, the ritual was a sacred rite, a way to ensure their people's survival. To many humans, it was a terrifying leap into the unknown, a step towards subjugation. Ariela stood still beside Ethan, her expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of her gaze upon him, a reminder of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. As tensions reached a boiling point, an urgent communication crackled through the station's comm system, cutting through the heated debate. "Security breach in the docking bay. All personnel report immediately." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The sabotage was no accident. Someone was trying to stop the ritual, again. And this time, they were targeting the station's core. "We need to move," Ethan said to Ariela, his voice low but urgent. Without hesitation, Ariela nodded. Together, they moved toward the docking bay, the weight of the situation heavy on their shoulders. As they passed through the hallways, the tension among the diplomats was palpable. Every step they took seemed to echo with the weight of what was at stake. When they arrived at the docking bay, chaos was already unfolding. The security breach had been a diversion, allowing a group of rebels, human and Vora alike, to infiltrate the station's primary defense systems. It was clear now, this wasn't just about stopping the ritual. This was a battle for control over the future of both species. Ariela's eyes flashed with a rare, fierce anger. "These fools do not understand." Ethan met her gaze. "No one ever does." The two of them rushed into the fray, weapons in hand, prepared to stop the insurgents who threatened to tear the fragile alliance apart. But even as they fought side by side, the shadow of political opposition loomed over them. The forces working against the connection ritual were growing stronger, and the future of humanity and the Vora was more uncertain than ever. The political conflict that had been simmering under the surface was now fully unleashed. It wasn't just about the connection ritual anymore, it was about power, control, and the survival of both species in a galaxy that was shifting beneath their feet. The bond that Ethan and Ariela had started to build was now the focal point of a war they had not yet anticipated. With enemies on both sides, human and Vora alike, Ethan and Ariela's mission was more dangerous than ever. The future of their people, the ritual, and their connection was at a precipice. If they failed to navigate this treacherous political landscape, everything they had fought for would be lost. The question now was, could their bond be strong enough to withstand the mounting opposition? Or would the political forces conspiring against them tear it all apart before they had a chance to succeed? The days following the attack and the heated political conflict were tense. Yet, for some reason, Ethan felt a subtle change in the atmosphere around him. Every training session, every shared moment in the halls of the station, seemed to carry a new weight. It wasn't just the external threats anymore. There was something growing between him and Ariela, a connection that neither of them could easily deny. Though neither was willing to fully acknowledge it just yet. As they walked through the corridors, side by side, the strange silence that had once marked their interactions now felt different. It was no longer uncomfortable or filled with tension, it was something else entirely. In the space between them, something unspoken lingered, something both delicate and powerful. Ethan was beginning to feel it in the air, like an electric pulse, and for the first time in a long while, he was unsure of what to do with it. It was another grueling morning in the training room. The metal walls hummed with the vibrations of the station, and the smell of sweat and exertion hung thick in the air. As usual, they began with physical training, pushing their bodies to the brink. But something had shifted this time. As Ethan sparred with Ariela, her movements seemed less like a demonstration of power and more like a dance. The force she used in every strike was still terrifying. But this time, Ethan noticed something else in her, something softer. When he dodged her punch, she didn't immediately follow up with a strike to take him down. Instead, there was a pause. Her eyes, usually so focused and intimidating, held something that caught him off guard: curiosity. Ethan, breathless and feeling the weight of her gaze on him, finally broke the silence. "What's going on, Ariela? You're holding back." Ariela's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've learned faster than I expected, Captain Cross." She didn't seem to elaborate on that, but the glint in her purple eyes told him that she was no longer just assessing his combat abilities. There was something deeper there, something about him that had shifted in her perception. Ethan met her gaze, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. "Maybe I'm not just a soldier to you anymore." His voice was low, but the words were deliberate. He didn't know why he said them, but in that moment, it felt true. For the first time, Ariela's expression softened, her usual stoic demeanor, the one that had always remained an impenetrable mask, cracked just enough for Ethan to see something else, something vulnerable. "Perhaps you're more than I thought," she said quietly, and for a moment, the entire world outside of their training room seemed to fall away. Later, as the training session ended and they walked back through the dimly lit hallways. A silence settled between them, but it was no longer awkward. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, something both of them felt but neither knew how to address. Ariela's enormous footsteps echoed alongside Ethan's more measured ones. But this time, the difference in their sizes didn't feel so pronounced. They moved in sync, almost like equals, and for the first time, Ethan felt like they were truly together in this, fighting for the same cause, navigating the same dangers, and even dealing with the same emotions. "What now?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "Where do we go from here?" Ariela glanced at him, her purple eyes soft but intense. "You have already started to change me, Captain." She paused, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "And perhaps I am changing you as well." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Was it possible? Could their bond really go beyond the physical and mental training they had undergone together? For the first time, he didn't feel like just a soldier completing a mission. He felt something else, a part of something greater. The next day, as they went through their routine, it became impossible to ignore the undeniable connection that had started to develop between them. It wasn't just about fighting side by side or preparing for the ritual anymore, it was about something more personal. During a break in training, Ariela sat down on one of the benches. Her gaze turned toward the station's large windows, where Earth hung like a blue and white marble in the sky. Ethan, always the soldier, noticed her demeanor had shifted. She was quieter, contemplative in a way that was unusual for her. Without thinking, Ethan approached, taking a seat next to her. "What's on your mind?" he asked softly. Ariela turned to look at him. Her deep purple eyes locked onto his. There was a silence between them that felt heavier than usual. After a long moment, she spoke. "I was thinking about how different we are," she said, her voice unusually soft. "You are so small, fragile, compared to me." Ethan chuckled lightly, though the comment stung more than he let on. "I'm starting to see how you feel about that." Ariela's lips twitched with a smile. "It's not just your size," she said, her voice becoming almost gentle. "It's your resilience, your ability to adapt, even when I see you struggle. You do not give up. You are unlike anything I have known before." Ethan turned to her fully now, feeling a wave of emotion that he couldn't quite describe. He had always known that this mission was important. But now, sitting next to Ariela, sharing this quiet moment, he realized that something else had happened. They were no longer just partners, they had become something more. They were connected in a way that words couldn't capture. Ariela looked down at him, her towering frame casting a shadow over his smaller, human form. "And you have changed me. I thought I would never allow myself to care for another being outside of my people. But now, I find myself wanting to protect you." Ethan felt his heart race at her words, a warmth spreading through him. This was real. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission anymore. There was something undeniably personal in their connection. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Later that evening, as the station's artificial lights flickered above them, Ethan and Ariela found themselves standing together in a quiet corner of the station. The weight of everything they had been through, training, political conflicts, physical and mental trials, was beginning to sink in. But even more so, the weight of their unspoken feelings was becoming harder to ignore. "I don't know how we got here," Ethan said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. "But I can't deny it anymore. You mean more to me than I ever thought possible." Ariela's eyes softened, and for the first time since they had met, she reached down and gently touched his face, her massive hand cradling his cheek with a tenderness that shocked him. "I did not think it was possible either," she whispered, her voice filled with an unexpected vulnerability. "But I am learning that I do not want to live without you." In that moment, everything around them faded. The dangers, the political strife, the ritual, none of it mattered. They were no longer two soldiers fighting for a cause. They were two beings who had found something in each other that transcended all else. Their bond was no longer just about diplomacy. It was about love. A love neither of them had expected but both needed more than they realized. The weight of the universe seemed to press down on Captain Ethan Cross as he stood in the dimly lit corridor of the Lunar Diplomatic Station. He had heard the rumors, felt the whispers in the halls, and seen the tension in the eyes of the diplomats. The Vora Connection Ritual, which was supposed to be the key to human-Vora cooperation, had now become the center of a political storm. Enemies lurked not just outside the station, but within, in the very heart of the station's corridors and assembly halls. The rebels, who had infiltrated the station before, were not just trying to sabotage the ritual, they were trying to tear down everything it represented. Human and Vora factions who feared the balance of power shifting had now turned their resistance into something much more dangerous: open rebellion. The political pressure was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. It wasn't just about diplomacy anymore, it was about survival. And yet, here they were, Ethan and Ariela, standing on the precipice of something that could either unite or destroy their people. Ethan turned to face Ariela, who stood a few feet away, her towering form silhouetted against the station's pale lights. She had remained resolute throughout the entire ordeal, but Ethan could sense a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a hesitation that he knew was shared by both of them. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice low, but urgent. "The rebels will be on us soon. We either proceed with the ritual now or risk losing everything." Ariela's deep purple eyes met his, unwavering. For a moment, the silence between them felt heavier than ever before. The political strife, the sabotage, the growing pressure, it was all leading to this single moment. "I know," she replied, her voice filled with an intensity that could not be denied. "But are you ready, Ethan? Are you ready to make this choice?" Ethan's mind raced. They had spent weeks training together, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, building a bond that had become more than just necessary for the ritual, it had become real. He had never imagined this mission would evolve into something so personal, so life-altering. But now, with the fate of both humanity and the Vora hanging in the balance, the decision weighed on him more than any battle ever had. In the past, Ethan had always been a soldier, driven by duty, prepared to sacrifice anything for the greater good. But this was different. The ritual wasn't just about survival or strategy, it was about something more fundamental: connection. A shared future, a new world order that could either unite them, or divide them forever. I don't know if we're ready for this," Ethan admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "The risks are enormous." Ariela, she took a step closer, her immense form casting a long shadow across him, her presence overwhelming. Her voice was low, but firm, filled with a conviction that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "We have no choice, Captain Cross." Ariela's gaze never wavered. "The fate of our people depends on this. Not just the ritual, but the bond between us. This is bigger than you and me. It's about the future of both our species." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Ethan knew she was right. If they didn't complete the ritual now, all of their efforts, all their struggles, would have been in vain. The political resistance would swallow them whole, and humanity's future would remain uncertain, fragmented. The Vora, too, would remain isolated, unable to unlock the potential of what they could become if they succeeded. He looked up at Ariela, feeling the weight of her gaze, of her trust. For the first time, he realized that this ritual wasn't just about diplomacy or politics, it was about their own bond. Their trust, their willingness to cross an impossible divide. And it wasn't something that could be forced or manipulated. He could see it now, in her eyes, the same uncertainty, the same doubt, but also the same resolve. She wasn't backing down, and neither could he. "Then we do it," Ethan said, his voice steady. "The decision made, we perform the ritual, together." Without another word, they moved toward the designated chamber. The air around them seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if the entire station knew what was about to happen. The ritual chamber was sterile, but not cold. The walls glowed with soft, pulsing light, the very atmosphere heavy with the potential of what they were about to attempt. Ariela stepped forward, her tall frame imposing as always, but there was a quiet elegance in the way she moved now. It wasn't just her physical strength that commanded respect, it was the emotional depth she had allowed Ethan to see in her. They stood in the center of the chamber, the space between them charged with a mixture of tension and something else, something raw, almost magnetic. Ethan's heartbeat in his chest like a drum, the reality of the moment settling over him. Ariela's voice, usually a commanding growl, was now a soft whisper, almost intimate. "Are you ready?" she asked, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for any sign of hesitation. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. "I'm ready." Ariela stepped forward, her massive hand hovering just inches from his. Ethan took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling, but he reached out. Their hands met, and in that moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The station, the political strife, the looming threat of sabotage, all of it faded away as the power of the ritual surged through them. The ritual was supposed to bind their minds, their spirits, their very essence. As their hands locked, Ethan felt it, the pulse of energy between them. It wasn't just telepathic, it wasn't just physical, it was something more, something that transcended the boundaries of their species. His thoughts collided with Ariela's in a burst of clarity. The flood of sensations overwhelmed him. Her strength, her history, her struggles, all of it flooded his mind. But there was something else, something he hadn't expected, the feeling of her emotions, raw and unfiltered, coursing through him. It was a bond unlike anything he had ever known. Ariela, too, was experiencing the same overwhelming connection. He could feel her breath, her heartbeat, her every thought intermingling with his own. It was a strange, dizzying sensation, intimate and powerful. He felt her fear, her hesitation, but also her deep-rooted courage, her will to protect not just her people, but him. It was a merging of two souls, as though they were becoming one, not in body, but in mind and spirit. Ethan could feel the essence of Ariela, the Vora warrior, and in return, he offered her a piece of himself. A soldier, yes, but something more, a man with a hope for a better future. A future that now seemed more possible than ever. The intensity of the connection nearly overwhelmed him. But he held on. He had to. They both had to. As the ritual reached its peak, Ethan's mind expanded beyond the physical space of the chamber. He saw flashes of Ariela's homeworld, the towering cities of the Vora, the weight of their warrior culture pressing down on her. He felt the responsibility she carried, the loneliness she had endured. And yet, through it all, there was something undeniable, a longing for connection. And in that moment, Ethan realized the full scope of what this ritual meant, not just for their people, but for them. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. And Ariela wasn't just a warrior. They had crossed a line, a threshold, and there was no going back. The connection had transformed them, both physically and emotionally. As they slowly broke the bond, their minds still intertwined, Ethan and Ariela knew that their worlds, their futures, and their relationship would never be the same again. But as the ritual came to an end, they both knew that the true challenge had only just begun. The political opposition would only grow fiercer, and their enemies, human and Vora alike, would stop at nothing to tear them apart. But Ethan and Ariela stood united, their bond now stronger than ever. Together, they had made their choice, and now, they would face whatever came next, side by side. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the station's life support systems. But for Captain Ethan Cross and Ariela, the Vora warrior, the atmosphere felt thick with anticipation. They stood at the center of the ritual space, the walls illuminated with a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to pulse with the energy of their connection. They had made the decision. The Vora Connection Ritual was no longer just a duty. It was their only hope, a hope not just for survival, but for the unity of their people, their species, and their future. As Ethan stood beside Ariela, he felt a deep sense of calm settle over him. The chaos of the last few days, the attacks, the political pressure, the sabotage, had all led to this moment. But now, there was no room for doubt, no time for second guessing. The moment to cross the final threshold was here, and there was no turning back. Ariela turned to him, her towering form casting a long shadow across the room. Her purple eyes, once cold and calculating, were softer now, filled with something far more personal. Ethan could feel the change in her, the transformation that had been quietly building between them for weeks. "Are you ready, Ethan?" Ariela asked, her voice steady but tinged with something like vulnerability. Her hand, massive and powerful, hovered just inches from his, waiting for him to make the next move. Ethan nodded, meeting her gaze. He had never felt more certain in his life. "I'm ready, Ariela, let's do this." As they clasped their hands together, the energy in the room shifted. Ethan could feel it immediately, the pulse of power that surged between them. Raw and untamed, it wasn't just the physical contact, but something much deeper. It was as though their very souls were touching, intertwining in a way that defied explanation. Their bond had been forged over weeks of training, communication, and shared experiences, but now it was evolving into something far more profound. Ethan's mind, once firmly anchored in the world of military strategy, began to expand. He felt his thoughts merge with Ariela's, her memories flooding into his consciousness like a tidal wave. He saw her past, the pressure of being chosen as a representative for the Vora, the weight of her people's expectations, the loneliness she had endured as a warrior standing alone. He felt the sheer force of her strength, the battles she had fought, not just against enemies, but against the loneliness that had always defined her existence. But he also felt something else, something unexpected, a flicker of tenderness, a desire to connect that she had hidden deep within herself. Ariela, despite her fierce exterior, yearned for the same thing Ethan had always hoped for: understanding. And in return, Ariela felt the pull of Ethan's emotions, his deep-rooted desire for unity and peace. She could sense the isolation he had lived with, the weight of being a soldier without family, without ties to keep him grounded. She could feel the depth of his heart, the way he cared for the future of both species, and how his hope for their connection transcended everything he had ever known. Their minds began to sync with a startling intensity, their thoughts and feelings blending seamlessly. The ritual wasn't just a mental exercise, it was a visceral, emotional experience. They could feel each other's pulse, their breath, the rhythm of their hearts beating in sync. As the connection deepened, Ethan felt himself change. His body, though still human, seemed to pulse with a new energy, one that was not entirely his own. He could feel Ariela's strength coursing through him, her raw power, her discipline, her warrior's spirit, and yet, he also felt something of himself inside her. It was as though they had become two halves of a whole, their differences now a source of strength rather than division. Ariela's massive form shifted slightly, her eyes now glowing with the same light as Ethan's, a sign that the ritual was working. She could feel his human energy, his creativity, his adaptability, weaving into her own being, his ability to navigate the complexities of the human heart, the intricacies of emotion, was something she had never experienced before. As their minds intertwined further, something remarkable happened. Their bodies began to transform. The energy of their connection was reshaping them. Ethan's muscles became more responsive, his senses heightened, and his agility improved as if the best of the Vora's physical attributes had merged with his own. Meanwhile, Ariela felt lighter, her once imposing figure carrying a grace that was unfamiliar but undeniably powerful. She was stronger than she had ever been, but now, there was a new fluidity in her movements, an elegance that had not existed before. This transformation was not just physical, it was spiritual. Their bond was creating a new reality for them both. It was no longer about fighting battles or defending territories. It was about something much deeper, something that would change the course of their history forever. The final stage of the ritual was upon them. Their thoughts and emotions were now fully aligned. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore, it was about understanding each other at a fundamental level. They could hear each other's unspoken desires, feel the depth of each other's fears and hopes. They had become a single entity, a fusion of two species, two souls. In that moment, everything around them seemed to fade away. The station, the political pressures, the threats that loomed, they no longer mattered. All that existed was the connection between them. Ethan felt Ariela's hand tighten around his, a gesture that was both powerful and intimate. He felt her presence inside him, as if she were a part of his very being. And for the first time, he truly understood her. He could see her people's history, their struggles, their triumphs. He felt their ancient longing for connection, for understanding, and in return, Ariela could see the future of humanity through Ethan's eyes, their potential for greatness, their ability to rise above the chaos and uncertainty. It was more than just a connection. It was a rebirth, not just for them, but for their entire species. As the ritual ended, the chamber slowly returned to its quiet stillness. Ethan and Ariela stood there, their hands still intertwined, but something had shifted between them. They had not just bridged the gap between their species. They had transformed each other. And through that transformation, they had unlocked the potential for a new future, one where humanity and the Vora could live side by side. Not as separate entities, but as a unified force. Ethan looked at Ariela, his heart pounding. But this time, there was no fear, there was no uncertainty, there was only a profound sense of connection, a bond that could never be broken. "We did it," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with awe. Ariela nodded, her purple eyes reflecting the same awe. "Yes, Ethan, we did." They stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of what they had just accomplished settling over them. This was just the beginning. The connection ritual had changed them. But it was the love, the trust, and the bond they had built through it that would define their future. And as the door to the ritual chamber slid open, revealing the world outside, filled with challenges, enemies, and unknown dangers, Ethan and Ariela knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just two beings from different species. They were one, and together, they would shape the future of the galaxy.